Oh, Okay, hello again. Welcome to our chapter on the executive branch from Barbour's AmGov book. Obviously, the executive branch talking mostly about the president, but if you've done the reading, we know that, or you'll know that this gets into the federal bureaucracy as well, which is something obviously we all know and love. But anyway, let's dive in head first and get moving here. What is an executive anyway? Well, we're probably used to hearing the term more often than not nowadays in reference to business, right? Chief executive officer, right? Executives make decisions. Executives are leaders. In a political context or politically, we can often think of the prime minister or president of a country as the chief executive. To use the term of a former president from Texas, George W. Bush, the president is the decider, right? And again, I'll reiterate the point: most businesses are run by executives, right? You need people who have the power to make executive decisions, right? Which is a term we use, but important decisions, quick decisions, right? Key elements of the job description of the American president. President obviously has limited power in the Constitution. We know this. This is what we've been dancing around for the first several weeks of class here. Today, in practice, Barbour makes the case, and I don't disagree, that power comes from the strength of the United States, like as a country, the world's largest economy, the world's largest military. The fact of the matter is, as I'll point out later, the explicit rules of the president have not grown over time, but yet the power of the presidency has, and this has a lot to do with the power of the United States as a country in the world, a wider network of countries, right? The requirements of how to become president are spelled out in Article 2 of the Constitution. You got to be 35 years old, natural born citizen of the United States, et cetera, et cetera. This is not to say that the job description has ever been amended. The 12th Amendment changed how we elect a president. It used to be that whoever won the Electoral College was president. Whoever came in second was named vice president. And that was until the 12th Amendment, which was passed in, I want to say, the early 1800s. Could you imagine 2016 if President Trump had been declared with Vice President Hillary Clinton as the number two, right? That would have made for a more interesting 4 years than the 4 years we had under President Trump. But I'm kind of glad that we don't do this, right? The idea is that both president and vice president will be of the same party, and that they'll work together better that way, right? The 20th Amendment changed the start of the term. It used to be that inauguration day was in March. Now it's in January. So it shortens the period, the lame duck session it's called, between presidents, if there's an outgoing president and an incoming president. The 22nd Amendment established term limits. This was after Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose name will come up again in a minute, after he was elected 4 times, and then in his 4th term decided to drop dead. Congress then decided to lead the charge in amending the Constitution. The 25th Amendment lays out the plan for presidential succession if there's ever a need. It does provide for the cabinet to remove a president if the cabinet needs to. It's never happened. But that also maps out, if a president's incapacitated, then what does the vice president do and who comes after, right? And I'll come back to that in a minute too. Or I'll transition to it right now. I forget what order my slides are in here. So who does the job when the president can't? Again, this is mapped out in tandem with the 25th Amendment here, the Presidential Succession Act. Obviously, constitutionally, the vice president takes over. And then if the vice president were to drop dead immediately after, at the same time as the president, the Speaker of the House would take over as number 3. Number 4 is the president pro tempore of the Senate, who's really just the longest serving member of the Senate of the party that's in the majority at the time. So it's usually some pretty old dude. And then beyond that, it's the secretaries of departments. But do remember, the vice president is constitutionally the president of the Senate. But the vice president is not always there in the Senate for proceedings, right? So the president pro tempore, again, the longest serving member of the majority party of the Senate, is what we call the president pro tempore, sort of like a de facto president. But anyway, that's the number 4 in line for the presidency. Two conflicting responsibilities that make the U.S. executive's job hard to do. Well, the presidents really have two jobs if you think about it, right? There's the ceremonial head of state role. The president is right there to shake hands with visiting world leaders and such. The president goes and speaks at the opening of the UN every year, for example. But these aren't jobs that really are politically, I mean, they're political in and of themselves, but the job is representing the country, right, as the head of state, not necessarily, acting as a partisan head of government, right? These are two separate jobs that presidents do simultaneously, right? And some say it can be difficult to balance both roles, and that's why some democracies separate the jobs. So, quick and easy example would be the United Kingdom, right? You've got Queen Elizabeth, who, by the way, has a deal with the devil to live to be a million years old. She is the head of state with no real political power, and the prime minister of the UK is the partisan head of government, right? So, again, in the United States, these two functions are fused into one role. In other democracies, they're divided into two separate positions, right? And in other countries like Germany elects a president who really is just the symbolic leader, and it's the chancellor who's the prime minister who does all the work. So, varies from country to country, we'll put it that way. Let's break down executive power. What do presidents actually do, right? The president is a chief administrator by appointing, say, judges and justices to the federal bench, appoints ambassadors, other high cabinet appointments as well. The president is, of course, the commander in chief, so responsible for waging war when the time comes. Analogous to that, the president is also the chief foreign policy maker, right? So the chief diplomat or diplomat in chief, as the president sometimes called, negotiates and signs treaties. This hyperlink here, you can't click on it in the video, but you can in the separate independent PowerPoint, and I'll put the links in the module for along with this PowerPoint and this video. This is a very silly and very partisan Saturday Night Live sketch that makes fun of then incoming President Trump and his foreign policy bona fides, we'll put it that way. I will have more hyperlinks, and again, I apologize that you can't click on them directly in the video. Hit pause, go watch the video if you want, or watch them all later. I don't expect everyone to watch every video. They're mostly comedy skits and things and satire, but I'll tell you when I really think watching them will benefit you. But anyway, moving on. Let's think about checks and balances. And again, we've covered a bit of this thus far in the semester, but the president does have checks on Congress, right? The president every year goes and addresses Congress in the State of the Union. It's kind of ceremonial, but it's basically the one way that the president can say, hey, I'm going to use this bully pulpit and tell you what I want, and I expect you to help me, especially those in the same party as the president, attain these goals. Presidents can obviously veto bills after they've been passed by Congress. That's a check on Congress, which you noticed was mentioned in the I'm Just a Bill up on Capitol Hill video. And then presidents can issue executive orders. Here's another hyperlink. This goes to a Saturday Night Live clip that makes fun of former President Obama and his penchant for using executive orders. Executive orders are basically a president's way of saying, here's what I think the law should be, and I'm going to act accordingly, but without an act of Congress, right? So generally speaking, you like executive orders when a president you support issues them, and you don't like executive orders when a president you don't like issues them. And thus, as you can imagine, when President George W. Bush came in after Bill Clinton, signed a bunch of executive orders. When Obama came in after Bush, signed a bunch of executive orders undoing what Bush did. Then Trump came in after Obama, signed a bunch of executive orders undoing a bunch of what President Obama had done, and Biden did the same thing. So it's a partisan instrument, we'll put it that way, as it exists today, but still influential in our daily lives. And this hyperlink here is pretty funny. It's a spoof on the I'm Just a Bill on Capitol Hill. I do recommend you watch it if you like to laugh. It's not going to change your life. But the president also holds the judicial branch in check through pardoning power, right? So the federal bench, the federal court can, of course, convict someone of a crime, and a president, duly elected executive, can pardon that person, right? Pardoning power here. This hyperlink takes you to a clip from The Daily Show, I believe, with visiting Daily Show commentator Hassan Minhaj, talking about pardoning power, the history of it, and whether or not President Trump could have pardoned himself. So anyway, have a look at that. Again, if you like to laugh, there are a lot of bad jokes. Watch it as you wish. But anyway, moving on. Well, continuing with executive orders. This is from another textbook that I teach from on U.S. Government, but you can see, even though I've cut off on the left-hand side, I apologize, I didn't realize this till now, that the use of executive orders has definitely gone up, right? You can see from 1900 to 1991, the use of executive orders going through the roof, and that trend has only continued since, right? Only continued since. And if you've watched the executive orders skit from Saturday Night Live, you have a better idea of what's going on. But anyway, let's think about the evolution of the American presidency. Again, although, to my last point here, there's been no growth of formal powers of the president, the country has definitely changed over time. It's bigger, it's more complex to run. This has to do with the fact that it's expanded geographically, its population has grown, its population has become more diverse. We ask the government to do more and more things. So this has led to a more complex job for the president. So despite, again, the Constitution only having been modified 4 times and nothing really having to do directly with what the president can or can't do, the president's powers in practice have definitely expanded over time, right? This clashes a bit with the founders' vision, because the founders, as we know, fleeing oppressive governments in Europe, the founders wanted a very limited executive, right? That's why the executive under the Articles of Confederation barely had any power at all, right? And so the Constitution at present, again, signed in the late 1700s, created what we call the traditional presidency, with an executive that was much more beholden to checks and balances of the other branches. Then things changed, right? And we chalk this up in my field really to events and the necessity of presidents to act quickly and independently in the aftermath of the 1929 stock market crash, which triggered the Great Depression, which eventually led to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal program, which drastically expanded the role of the federal government in our daily lives, created things like Social Security, sowed the seeds for the modern welfare state, because the Depression required these things, and the federal government attempted really to, and was successful by spending its way out of the Depression. But this expansion of the federal government's power, and by extension that of the president, began the era of what we call the modern presidency, right? So really, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency was a game changer. However, I do like this line from the Barbour book quite a bit. Higher expectations, same old limited executive toolbox, right? So again, with FDR, his presidency really marked the change of the transitional presidency morphing into the modern presidency. And this had a lot to do, obviously, with what I just said, FDR expanding the role of the federal government, but he changed the nature of the relationship between president and the public, right? So he began, and I realize you weren't around at this time, and believe it or not, I was not yet born in the 1940s either. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt used radio, which was the big technological advancement at the time, the cusp of the television boom. But Roosevelt used the radio to communicate directly with the public in these what were called fireside chats that were televised live over the radio, right? And this then triggered what we see, an increase in presidential promises, right? When presidents and candidates for presidency communicate with us more and more directly, they make more and more promises, right? So it's why I say this. FDR increased presidential expectations by issuing more promises, but then that subsequently changed the game of presidential campaigning, and now pretty much, we elect the person who makes the most promises, it seems. But anyway, what tools does the president have to get around the limits of executive power? Well, again, continuing with the previous slide, presidents have the power to persuade, which again, Roosevelt did over the radio. There's a whole sub literature, subfield in presidential studies concerned with how presidents go public, which is to say they talk directly to us. And again, that moves beyond the radio now. It's live television, it's social media, it's the stupid Twitter, so on and so forth, right? And this again, we can see this rise of going public, and maybe even its limits in the age of mediated citizenship, which Barbour talks about. But at the same time, it's worth mentioning this mediated citizenship is not necessarily as new as we think. And I will refer you to Lyndon Baines Johnson, another good Texan, and his 1964 ad campaign for presidency, which is the famous Daisy ad, which, I will spoil it for you a bit. It's a very dark campaign ad that basically says, vote for Lyndon Baines Johnson or face nuclear war, right? This is the height of the Cold War at the time. But do watch this link. It's only a minute long. It was a real campaign ad in 1964. It might make you think and maybe reconsider polarization today, because again, it stopped short of saying it flat out, but basically LBJ was saying, vote for me or die, right? So have a look at that. How different interpretations of presidential power played out in the modern age. Again, the modern presidency is more powerful than the notions of the traditional presidency or the traditional office, as all presidents of both parties have clearly pushed the boundaries of presidential power. Some presidents will come in and say, like after Nixon, say, oh boy, Nixon was just off the charts, power hungry, and we're going to rein in the power of the presidency. But very few presidents actually do that. Obama gave some lip service to this after the Bush administration, but really didn't do anything effectively to limit the power of the presidency. So again, this is something that all presidents of both parties do. All presidents seek to expand the power of the presidency, really for themselves, with little consideration of the fact that inevitably there will be a president of the other party coming after, who will also take advantage of what previous presidents have done to expand power. But anyway, this really came to an apex, arguably, under the George W. Bush administration. Again, although I would argue that Obama did little to reduce the power of the presidency, but Obama at least didn't use this term, the executive or unitary executive theory, which is discussed in section 5.2 of the Barbour book, and it is clearly a theme in the Vice film that corresponds to this week's work that's due next week. So if you are going to watch the Vice film and write a film analysis paper, I strongly, strongly, strongly advise you to consider what little text is there in the Barbour book on the unitary executive theory and use that in one of your supporting points for your paper. Really, it's on a platter for you to use. But the unitary executive theory posits that really that the president is the focal point in the federal system, and that really the presidency should be more powerful. The executive branch should be more powerful than Congress, right? Which is not, as we know, which is not what the founders had in mind. I mean, there's a reason why Congress is mapped out in Article 1 and the executive is mapped out in Article 2, right? So anyway, think about, what role a president really should have vis-a-vis the Congress. Is the presidency too powerful nowadays? Something for you to think about and to feel free to opine about in your film analysis paper. Just make sure to back up your opinions with something from the texts. Anyway, the Trump effect, right? I mentioned earlier in the semester when we read, I believe it was as early as chapter 1 of the Barbour book, that I thought Barbour was pretty critical of what she called social progressives in particular, more than she was critical of social conservatives. In this chapter, she doesn't seem to be a big fan of President Trump. I mean, I would put this Professor Barbour, somewhere pretty in the middle of the political spectrum, if I had to guess. Because again, she's pretty critical of President Trump, who fashioned himself as a bit of a social conservative. And again, in chapter 1, she wasn't so critical of social conservatives in general as she was of social progressives. But anyway. She claims that President Trump has broken the mold of the U.S. presidency, pushed against traditional political norms, perhaps as a consequence of his lack of political background. But then she basically chalked him up as a weak president, which is defined as someone who can't get a president who can't get his. I say his because they've all been men up to now. Treatment of a weak president is a president who can't get his agenda passed through Congress, even when it's a friendly Congress, even when there is unified government, right? Unified government is when both houses of Congress, the House or both chambers, the House and the Senate, are of the same party as the president. That is unified government, and usually that means policy gets made more quickly because everyone's on the same page. But a weak president is one who, even though he has unified government, can't get policies passed through Congress, and that really sums up uh, the Trump presidency. I mean, Trump was able to pass the 2017 tax cuts because Congress wanted that, but beyond that, Congress really didn't just go along with the president in policy making, right? Publicly, more so, but when it comes down to making law, less so. Here is another figure from a different textbook that I use, but it's worth having a look at here. Yellow, underneath the red line, is where you see periods of divided government. So divided government contrasts with unified government, which is where you see the white underneath the red line. Oh shoot, is when we had unified government. I didn't know that my mouse was going to do that. My apologies. Um, I won't touch the mouse again. But divided government, as I explained, is when, or sorry, divided government in contrast with unified government. Divided government is when either the House or the Senate is in hands of a different party than the president's. And it usually means that you've got a lot more disagreement between the president and Congress. And that's when the red lines dip down and you see the presidential batting average drop, right? So the percentage of the time that president and Congress agree goes down when we have divided government, right? Logically, because again, the institutions aren't on the same political team. But this figure really helps us to understand the difference between divided and unified government. Like you can see at the end of the George W. Bush administration, 2006 to 2008, the Democrats took over the House, and all of a sudden George W. Bush couldn't get anything through, right? And similar things happened to both Obama and to Trump, as you can see pretty clearly. So pretty normal. So let's think about what factors make a president popular, right? Shifting gears a bit. I mean, this is circular logic, but to be a popular president, popularity seems to be a minimum requirement. But what does that mean? I think that means charisma, right? President Trump had some of that. President Obama had a lot of it. President Bush had some of it in a different way. President Clinton had a ton of it. Biden has next to none of it, right? Or maybe kind of in his own special way. But presidents tend to be charismatic. When we think about presidential popularity, there's really a cycle effect of the economy in general, honeymoon period more specifically, right after a president is elected. Usually, when a new president comes in, there's unified government, and that facilitates quick decision making. And we often talk about the first 100 days of a presidency and how consequential they are. It's a really meaningless measure, but that is a honeymoon period that the media definitely buys into, and that's sometimes when major legislation can get passed. Obviously, the economic well-being related to the cycle effect I just mentioned. When we don't want the government to interfere in the economy, yet when the economy takes a turn for the worse, we then blame the government for that, right? Which I find to be a bit contradictory. But anyway, whether or not the economy is going well has a lot of influence on what we think of the president. External events clearly do too. If it's something economic in another country that affects the United States, we might blame the president. If it's a natural disaster, oftentimes we rally together. September 11th, 2001 would be a pretty good example of an external event bringing people together and increasing a president's popularity. Polarization can also limit a president's popularity. I think this day and age, it's about 40% of the population either way that will just absolutely refuse to look positively upon a president of a party that they don't like. So there we are. Really, the rich independent middle of the spectrum has a lot to do. It's a lot to determine whether a president is popular or not. But we can look at external events. This photo is an iconic one taken on September 11th. I remember when this was taken. I was watching the news when President Bush appeared at Ground Zero, or sorry, in the week following the attack on the World Trade Center, September 11th. It wasn't the day of. There's a weird time when everything ran together, but anyway. President Bush then went public, addressed a joint session of Congress in late September of 2001. I remember listening to this on something called the radio while I was at work, but basically saying we're going to invade Afghanistan, and everybody was on board. I mean, just about everybody was on board. So that would be a good example of going public. We can talk about television appearances, right? Ellen DeGeneres used to be a pretty popular figure. I think less so nowadays, but Obama famously went on the Ellen DeGeneres show. Has a tendency to personalize a president. And presidents, obviously, nowadays have often been on television prior to becoming president. So we can talk about, someone with a long trajectory in the media who then used that arguably to become president in spite of the previously mentioned lack of political experience, right? If pretty much the entire country knows who you are, that can be advantageous to your political future, especially nationally, right? But this public appearances by presidents is nothing really new. Again, this is from a different textbook that I use, but you can see throughout the 20th century here and into the 21st that public appearances by presidents has just gone nowhere but up. Keep in mind that the tallest bars here, George W. Bush and Obama, were both two-term presidents. So if Trump had served another term, and we got to assume that 2020 there with the pandemic limited his public appearances, but that easily, if Trump had served 2 terms, that bar could have been twice as high as Bush and Obama's, right? So I think this is just the future, whether we like it or not. Presidents are going to be more and more visible. And then we'll just pass photos and news articles around. I use the term news loosely there, either praising or criticizing the president, whether we like the president in question or not. But get used to this. However, for the time being, despite the increase in visibility of the president, it'll be interesting to see if these numbers change over time. What history has shown us is that presidents lose popularity the longer they're in office, right? And we can see spikes. President Ford came in on a high after President Nixon resigned, and that resignation was, explained a lot of Nixon's plummet in popularity. For Lyndon Baines Johnson, it was the Vietnam War. Carter was just president at a very tumultuous time and a victim of circumstance, I think. Oil crisis, economic crisis, diplomatic crisis with Iran. Carter was not a very popular president at the time. Reagan saw some ups and downs, left office about as popular as when he came in, which is pretty rare. George H.W. Bush, a victim of economic cycles, downturn, lost the presidency. Clinton actually went up over time, which again is pretty rare. George W. Bush's presidency started off with 9/11 happening shortly thereafter, so we see a big spike in popularity, and then ended with the 2008 housing crash, so that plummeted his popularity. Obama came in high, rode it out, left office relatively unpopular, and Trump never surpassed 50% approval rating. So a bit of an anomaly, and it might be the future, because again, there's about 40% of us on either side who's just not going to get behind a president from another party. So I don't know if the Trump data, the Trump figures might be the future of the presidency from here on out for the time being. I don't really know. But let's continue talking about things that are relatively unpopular. Bureaucracy, right? So the president needs a bureaucracy to support what a president, to support the president's agenda, right? So because the president needs to work with Congress to get things done. I've talked about the difference between unified and divided government, how that can affect or limit or facilitate the accomplishment of what presidents want to do. But presidents have liaisons with Congress to try to get Congress people on board with what presidents want to do. And beyond that, again, it's the federal bureaucracy, right? So why do we need a bureaucracy? Why can't we just make all of our decisions democratically? Well, it's not very efficient, especially in a country of over 300 million people. Smaller countries like Switzerland do a lot by referendum, right? In I want to say September of 2021, the Swiss voted by referendum to legalize same-sex marriage and voted against a tax hike on the wealthy. But when your country is relatively small, you can do that. But in the United States, a larger country with geographically with a much larger population, we need efficient decision making, and that's again what presidents have come to do. There's a pyramid structure of power in a bureaucracy, and the executive bureaucracy is no exception. But it's the inverse of a democratic power structure, right? If we were in class, I'd draw some pyramids here, with the people at the bottom, at the base of the pyramid, and a president at the top. And if we're talking about a democratic power structure, right, power would go from the people up to the president. But in bureaucracy, it goes down from a president or an executive, a leader, whomever, down toward the bottom of the pyramid, right? So it's an inverse power structure of how we should think about democracy. But this is how even the private world, the private sector, organizes itself as well. Here's a clip. It's very stupid. To a few minutes from a film that when I was in college, you basically had to watch it to graduate, called Office Space, but very critical of the corporate world and its bureaucracies, right? It's comic relief. Skip it if you don't want to watch it. But it demonstrates the frustration that we all have with bureaucracies. And again, it serves to remind us that they also exist in the corporate world. But why don't we like bureaucracy? I think it's because we make the assumption that bureaucracies are pretty corrupt, right? And this is because of a perceived lack of transparency and accountability in the political realm. Although this happens in the private sector too, we seem to think that this is a consolidation of power from patronage, right? Patronage or clientelism, right? This is where you take care of your buddies. You give those close to you important positions, right? This in a bureaucracy, this is maybe not based on merit, which is the way things should be, right? But we perceive bureaucracy as a system that serves the interests of elected officials or of wealthy business elites in the private sector, right? So this is why I think we don't like bureaucracy generally. But if bureaucracy exhibited these four key characteristics of neutral competence that Barbour points out, I think it would be better for all involved, right? We need hierarchical power. That's the facilitates the quick decision making, but we need this power based on rules, right? We need appointment to the bureaucracy based on expertise, and we need promotion within the bureaucracy to be based on merit, right? You need training, and you need to prove yourself to move up the hierarchy of the rule-based power structure. But again, when patronage gets in the way, that doesn't happen, and that's when we think that bureaucracy is corrupt, right? But what about accountability and transparency, right? There are civil service laws that are meant to account for to limit corruption in the bureaucracy. And while we complain about red tape, which is really a figurative term, there's rarely tape that's actually red in a bureaucratic process, right? When you file your taxes, you don't put red tape on your tax return. But what we mean by red tape is more or less just a paper trail. But that paper trail can help those within the bureaucracy to trace what's gone on and to identify mistakes when they occur and try to fix them and prevent them in the future, right? That's what bureaucracies are meant to do. We view them from the outside as inherently inefficient, but they do internally strive to make better decisions, right? It's just a balance of bureaucratic decision making that goes on. And again, when we're on the outside and on the wrong end of it, when things get delayed, when you try to do something with the government office, we blame the bureaucracy, but rightly and wrongly, I would say. But anyway, the White House has a massive bureaucracy within it as well, and it's worth mentioning this. The text does, so I will here. But we need to think of a bifurcated bureaucracy. Bifurcated means split into two, right? There's a federal bureaucracy that's meant to serve the public, and then there's a White House bureaucracy that serves the president, right? That serves the president's interests. And White House bureaucracy is less subject to civil service guidelines or senatorial confirmation, right? So there's a team in the White House that the president picks that need not be confirmed by Congress, and that's the White House bureaucracy. The federal bureaucracy has a different tinge to it, and I'll get to that, I think, on the next slide here. But the executive office of the presidency was born in the New Deal expansion of federal power, which I talked about before, and it shouldn't surprise us then that this coincides with the expansion of presidential power. But this executive office of the presidency, created under federal Franklin Delano Roosevelt, creates a bureaucracy that's largely loyal to the president. It exhibits vestiges of the patronage system, has minimal Senate vetting, is managed by the president's chief of staff, who is probably the most loyal person to the president in the White House, and can include some agencies that help the president manage certain issues, whether that is, political advisor, economic advisor, so on and so forth. But these would not be agencies that are within federal departments, right? Because this, again, we're talking about who's loyal to the president. The federal bureaucracy that's loyal to the people, to the system, to the Constitution, includes the president's cabinet. And these are people who are political appointees named by the president and confirmed by the Senate. But cabinet members have a lot more independence from the president than do members of the White House or the executive office of the president, right? And these can be agencies, boards, and commissions, even the military, public corporations like agencies like NASA, public corporations like the Postal Service, so on and so forth, that really, although they're part of the executive branch, operate very independently of the president himself and the presidency, right? And again, much more subject to transparency guidelines and, again, independence from the president himself. So why have we seen this expansion of the executive branch? Well, rightly or wrongly, and I think rightly, it's because we ask more of the government. We make bigger demands. We want the government, even though we might not consciously think or say this, we want central functions to be performed by the federal government, right, to meet changing national needs. No matter where you are in the United States, if there's a natural disaster, no matter how far you are away from Washington, you want the federal government there to help, right? Which is a bit different than, say, 200 years ago, right? And the way the federal bureaucracy has developed, we can talk about clientele groups where, you've got, say, the Department of Agriculture working very closely with particularly large corporate farming interests who can even seek to shape decisions made by the Department of Agriculture, who could pressure members of Congress to pass legislation that's favorable to farmers that would be carried out by the Department of Agriculture. These are clientele groups that evolve. And then ultimately, of course, particularly after September 11th, again, we demand that the federal government keep us safe, which, again, I don't think is incorrect of us to do. But again, we want the government to do more and more things, and that has provides us a lot of the reason why federal government has expanded. But if we think about the three main bureaucratic roles, bureaucracy administers, it makes rules through bureaucratic discretion, and it passes judgment on certain cases that come up under different agency purviews. And I ask here, does this sound familiar? And that's because really within the executive branch, you find agencies, departments, etc., that fulfill functions that very much sound like an administrative executive role. The rulemaking sounds almost legislative, and judgment sounds pretty judicial, right? So we see a bit of overlap with all three branches of government just within the executive bureaucracy, right? Independent of the president himself, right? How's the federal bureaucracy organized? There's a nice chart in the text. I'm not going to ask you to memorize it. Barbour even says in the text, don't memorize the chart. But when we say departments, we're talking about, say, the Department of Education, Department of Defense, Department of Transportation, so on and so forth. Independent agencies are like NASA. Not like NASA. NASA is an independent agency. Independent regulatory boards, so the Federal Elections Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, so on and so forth. And government corporations would mean NASA and Amtrak, right? They function as businesses, even though they don't really turn a profit. And the reason they exist is because the lack of profitability means there's little private incentive to fulfill these needs in the economy, right? So anyway, three main drivers of political tension inside the bureaucratic world, right? From the outside, we tend not to like bureaucracy, but there are tensions even within it. We could talk about bureaucratic culture and the interest in self-preservation, protecting bureaucratic turf, and whistleblowers can disrupt that by saying, hey, hey, I found a problem, a lack of transparency, there's corruption in this agency, so on and so forth. There's a tension, there's a clash. We could talk about the tension between career staff, who are those who are hired by departments, like regular, bureaucrats, worker bees, like you and me, versus political appointments or political appointees, and they might have a different view as to what's best for the bureaucratic agency. Usually through the lens of what's best for the president who appointed those political appointees. We can talk about interagency tension and agency capture. Agency capture I've touched on with my example about the Department of Agriculture and farmers in Congress, where different bureaucratic agencies might end up actually, instead of protecting those they're meant to protect, but actually working for indirectly those they're meant to protect. But interagency tension, I'll give you a very simple example, is the tension that existed between the FBI and the CIA in the run up to September 11th, right? If the thinking went, the 9/11 Commission reached this conclusion that if there had been more communication between among the 16, 17 some federal intelligence agencies, if they had shared information to work collaboratively instead of being worried about their turf, arguably, then maybe the attack could have been prevented. But at the time, the FBI didn't want to give information to the CIA, and then the CIA catch Osama bin Laden or something and gain all the credit. So when you see agencies compete with each other, that is another way of hindering the efficiency and productivity of bureaucracies, and then perpetuate our negative opinions of it. But anyway, the bureaucracy and the president. Again, we've talked about how the White House has its own bureaucracy, but the president might not appreciate how the bureaucracy doesn't make decisions as quickly as a president might want. The bureaucracy butts heads often with Congress, and Congress can provide oversight of the executive bureaucracy, and then courts can obviously step in with judicial review, make decisions against the bureaucracy. So we can see tensions, again, among the three branches of government with bureaucracy. So where were we in class? We'd wrap up with this, is the rise of presidential power good for democracy? This is something I just want you to think about. You can ask a version of this question in the discussion board if you like. Address this in the vice paper should you choose. There's no right answer, but you might think, yes, the presidency is more directly accountable because it's a unitary institution and more highly visible. So that means presidential power is a good thing. We can vote a president out when we get the chance, but while in office, president needs a lot of leeway. We could say no, right? It's impossible for a president, whoever the president is, to represent the views of over 330 million Americans, and maybe an election every 4 years isn't enough, right? So reasonable people can disagree with this, but do keep this in mind when you watch Vice, right? And it might be that you think presidential power is a good thing when you like the president, and it's a bad thing when you don't. That's, I think, how a lot of us view the presidency. But anyway, I'd like for us to think about this beyond day-to-day contemporary politics, but it's unavoidable. So there you are. Things to think about. But I appreciate your attention. Sorry I went on for a little longer than I wanted to, but that's pretty much the normal. Take care. Be in touch.